I think there's a tremendous opportunity for land and livestock owners to benefit from equitable incentives for deferred compensation. And so in webinar number 2, I'd like to visit with you about what I've seen over the years in terms of current year incentives as well as long-term or deferred compensation options that that landowners, in many cases, could use very effectively when they find livestock owners that they're very pleased to work with. Those livestock owners are doing a great job, an exceptional job of managing their resources. And so take a look at some of the different questions that may be related to incentives and deferred compensation. Now, clearly, the pasture lease agreements should be designed to benefit rangeland resources and livestock owner relationships, and that's especially true with regard to long-term grazing leases. This is a critical beginning point in the discussion of incentives and deferred compensation. For the landowner, the relative value of incentives for optimizing grazing management really depends on the current and potential herbage production capacity of the rangeland. Now, clearly, everybody understands that there's going to be a world of difference between the carrying capacity or how much herbage the rangeland can produce, let's say from the eastern end to the western end of the state of Nebraska or any other state in the Great Plains. But within your given home or land or ranch location, the current condition really can have a big impact on how responsive your rangeland vegetation will be to enhanced or improved grazing. A very good idea to seek the advice of people who have years of experience with rotation grazing and have a pretty good idea of how long it might take for different kinds of rangeland in lower condition, say low good through the full range of poor, mid, and high fair condition. They have a good idea what kind of species should be there in order to get some fairly rapid responses to rotation grazing. So check the advice of the people who have years of experience with rotation grazing, trusted ranchers, qualified university or agency personnel, or contact a qualified consultant if you need help with this assessment. It really is a critical beginning point and will go a long ways towards helping to make the decision on whether or not to use incentives or deferred compensation for enhanced grazing management. Now, these cost reductions are percentages of the base price for the area, for the community, or the area where the ranch or the rangeland is located, and they're broken down into percentages that I think are really quite reasonable, and there will be a lot of variation in how livestock owners prefer to manage the grazing, how and what their experiences are, what their skill levels are. I think that when you have livestock owners that have the ability, the desire to use rotation grazing, they have the ability or the desire to do these other things, to graze, keep and share grazing records, as well as on-site precipitation records. This literally means that we've got a rain gauge somewhere on my property that's checked at least weekly anyway, as may also include permanent range photo points. Then the critical issue, again, this relates to the destocking issue we touched on in webinar 1. The drought plan if they provide a drought plan that has destocking guidelines and text on where those cattle would go in the event of destocking, that's worth a lot in terms of adjusting the base cost or price of the forage. And so, just very quickly, let me highlight these. Some grazing seasons that are 5 months or longer have great value because the amount of grazing pressure that occurs during rapid growth, which, for example, in the sandhills of Nebraska, would be especially notable throughout June and much of July. If we have a 2 or 3 month grazing season at the same time in consecutive years, that can be devastating and cause quite a reduction in the visit. But if we have a longer grazing season with rotation, that dramatically reduces grazing pressure during the rapid growth windows. And then the benefit of deferred grazing is not really substantial until we get to 4 pastures or more. Whether you have these pastures on your property or whether your single piece of rangeland is incorporated into a neighboring ranch where they have 4 or more pastures, doesn't make any difference how the combination is put together, but that's of considerable benefit. Now, the general guidelines for grazing management that should be considered for current year, I just got some recommended percentages on that table that we just looked at, but I think they could be justified. You may want to discuss the percentages up or down, but 2-3% incentive I think is very reasonable. General guidelines here, it's in your best interest as a landowner and a livestock owner to use moderate stocking rates because this controls the amount of herbage that's left on the ground to optimize the infiltration of water and minimize soil surface temperature extremes. Those environmental impacts are huge in terms of productivity of your rangeland. Then it's really important to understand that there can be a considerable difference from east to west in the Great Plains in terms of what you would consider to be enhanced grazing management. Now, in the semi-arid region of rangeland in the Great Plains, which is outlined in Webinar 3, we would generally recommend that you only graze pastures 1 time per year. But if the availability of soil water is greater, which could be sub-irrigated meadows anywhere in the Great Plains, or as you move eastward and get into higher levels of precipitation, you move into the subhumid. And in those situations, we would then be recommending that you go with 2 or more times per year, because in those cases, the availability of soil water and the length of the growing season are so long that you will have a substantial loss of herbage production potential if they are not grazed 2 or more times. Additional guidelines would be, as I've said before, pay for what you use contracts are best. I know there are a lot of landowners that have in the past used dollar per acre contracts, but cattle do not graze acres, they graze forage. And the other issue here is that by paying for what you use, using a contract based on that process, you have more flexibility and more assurance working with livestock owners that have a commitment to enhance grazing management, of retaining that relationship. The worst case scenario would be to have a fixed dollar value per acre and then encounter a 1, 2, or even 3 years of drought and have a situation where the livestock owner is paying for forage that they are not even using. The other issue here is the importance of using animal unit equivalents to account for differences in forage consumption as livestock weights change. We went over that in webinar number 1. Now, if we take a look at common concerns, these are topics or issues that have been common in my discussions with landowners and livestock owners over the last 3.5 decades. And so let's take a look at each of these. Timely and adequate destocking responses for drought, hail, or fire are absolutely critical for maintaining long-term business relationships, as well as accomplishing the goal or goals of the lease. Webinar 1, we talked about how important it is to begin the lease with a very clearly stated goal. And the most common goal that I have seen is to improve range land condition. So it's a critical issue. These other issues are very much related to, they would involve the involvement of both landowners and livestock owners, and they're very clearly stated here. And that is that people, even after you have things down in a contract, sometimes there are different kinds of events that are unforeseen, or you just need to have flexibility. And it could be that flexibility becomes, it may be especially important in wet years where you have levels of herbage produced. And there's a situation, for example, where at the end of the growing, after killing frost, certainly allows some additional herbage used by, let's say, dry cows, then the livestock owner would have an opportunity to use more forage over a longer time period. But the biggest challenge is sometimes people, livestock owners, will want to increase stocking rates, but there's no way of really knowing when you're going to have an abundance of forage produced in a given year, literally until you get through the rapid growth windows, which typically are going to be occurring in May, June, and on into July. So most often I recommend that if there's going to be some increases in stocking and the number of EUMs sold in a given year, it actually works best to just simply take a look at using that forage with dry cows after killing frost. Both parties have to be committed to contract compliance, and the quality of communication and the demeanor of both parties is important, and both parties are going to be involved in the discussion of what is fair, and this is where we go into deferred compensation oftentimes. But let's move on to those issues. What are the most common justifications for deferred compensation? Well, good grazing management and upkeep that increases the carrying capacity and market value of the land would be very deserving of compensation or incentives. Now, initially we looked at those as current year incentives of a percentage, a small percentage for each category of enhanced grazing management. That we may be looking at a situation where you're happy, it's a very good business relationship. You want to, the landowner wants to maintain that relationship with the livestock owner. Here's a situation where you would most certainly want to take a look at some way to share the benefits with the livestock owner. Another category of justification would be situations where the lessee provides labor, material, or finances for capital improvements. And you say, well, what are capital improvements? Well, normally the livestock owner is responsible for the maintenance of fences, and in that process, the landowner would be covering the cost of posts and wire, and the livestock owner would cover the labor, the fuel, those kinds of things. But when we get down to the installation of livestock water facilities, that goes way beyond maintenance. Just annual servicing would fall into the normal labor category of the livestock owner. But if it gets to the point where we're talking about building new fences, major repairs or new installations of water facilities, it could be buildings. These things are capital improvements. And so some forward thinking in terms of if the landowner does not have the capital to deal with these things, then it would be very justifiable for the landowner to consider some of the following deferred compensation options to fairly and fully compensate the lessee in the future. Then there are also situations where they're in an operation, and this may be neighbors, it may be family members, where there are years, multiple years, where labor and other inputs are provided without full compensation. My experiences here are related primarily to estate settlements, but they may also be related to long-time lessee relationships, neighbors as well. So let's take a look at some of these compensation options. Number one, we've already addressed, and that is that you could shift if you have a good relationship, landowner, livestock owner relationship. You could very certainly consider a shift from a one-year pasture lease to a multiple-year. Remember that your multiple-year lease, as I indicated in webinar number one, that you would want to go through some periodic adjustments for a number of things, including the cost of forage, animal unit equivalents, and improved or temporarily reduced herbage production potential. The second area where you may want to consider so incentives or compensation would be to discount the base price of forage by a selected percentage or hold the base price constant in a multi-year contract. Well, the first part of the statement is directly related to the current year or annual adjustments in the table at the beginning of this webinar. The second issue is that, for example, if you could do that, you could choose that approach, or maybe the landowner's not in a situation where they feel like they could reduce the cost of grass that much in the current year, then you may want to consider this as an option. If we take a look at the long-term averages for the change in market value, I can say if you have a 5-year contract at the current 2014 fair base price per forage in your area and held that constant for 5 years, at the end of that contract period, the livestock owner will receive about an 8% reduction in the cost of grass for that 5-year timeline. So if the landowner's not in a situation where they feel like they can handle the numerical values that are posted in that table at the beginning of this webinar, then you may want to consider a multi-year, say a 5-year contract. You start with a fixed value and make no adjustments over time, realizing full well that that's the compensation model that you're going to use. Let's move on to other possibilities. Another possibility, as far as deferred compensation is concerned, had a first right of refusal clause for the subsequent pasture lease. In other words, whether it's a 1-year or multiple-year lease, if there's a good relationship between the landowner and the livestock owner, this makes sense. This is a way where you are sharing the benefit of the enhanced grazing management. Now that would be a first right of refusal on the lease, and I think it's really important. Make sure you identify property, and you need to make sure that in this particular first right of refusal clause, that you also make it contingent upon compliance. Another option would be to provide a first right of refusal contract for the purchase of a specified land parcel. this is a situation that becomes justifiable in my mind, where the landowner and livestock owner have established a long-term beneficial relationship, where clearly the livestock owner has not only been very good at meeting the expectations of the grazing lease arrangement, but also has done other things that have been beneficial, uh, including the possibility of helping out with capital improvements. But so here's a situation where at least that individual, the livestock owner, would have a first right of refusal on buying a property. Oftentimes these are set up where the properties adjoin. This property is either surrounded or next door to the livestock owner's property, that kind of a geographic relationship. A fifth possibility for deferred compensation is to literally add a percentage discount on the future appraised value of the property in addition, in a first right of refusal purchase contract. And so, how good has the relationship been? How long-standing has it been? Um, how much have you benefited? How much do you want to help this individual out? This is not just necessarily a relationship that is the result of an older livestock owner. This could be a relationship where perhaps there's been a change in transition, and the next generation livestock owner is doing a wonderful job, and you may not have any heirs, or the heirs are not terribly interested. You may want to throw this in as a deferred compensation option. And the last one that I would offer for your consideration is to take a look at, and again, this relates much more to often ranch family members or people that have a very, very long standing of input and care. Sometimes this even involves care of the parents and grandparents, but literally the outright future receipt of the title for a specified parcel of land at a specified date or event in the life of the landowner. This would be the absolute largest form of deferred compensation. So those are suggestions for your consideration that I think can be fully justified in the right set of circumstances. You may want to consider these in the current year based on your current situation, or keep them in mind as you go through this process of working with livestock owners.